As Jamal Freeman cruises through his rich neighborhood in his sleek black Porsche, he feels a sense of accomplishment. Little does he know, his world is about to be turned upside down by a single traffic stop. What unfolds next will challenge everything he thought he knew about justice and equality. Officer Karen Michaels patrols the streets, her eyes scanning the pristine lawns and grand houses. She can't shake a troubling feeling as she watches the residents, her old beliefs affecting what she sees. When Jamal's car comes into view, something feels off. She squints and decides what to do. The flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror startles Jamal from his peaceful thoughts. His brow furrows as he guides his car to the curb, unaware of the ordeal that awaits him. The weight of what's to come hangs in the air, invisible yet noticeable. As Officer Michaels approaches the vehicle, her hands rest on her holster, betraying an immediate readiness for confrontation. Her stern aura radiates suspicion as she approaches the driver's side window. Jamal's heart races, but he keeps a calm exterior, fully aware of the risks of showing any signs of agitation. However, what happens next is completely unexpected and terrifying.
License and registration,
Michaels demands, her voice tinged with an edge that suggests this is more than a routine traffic stop. Jamal complies without hesitation, his movements deliberate and measured as he retrieves the requested documents from the glove compartment. As he hands them over, he can't help but notice the officer's suspicious gaze, her eyes darting between his face and the luxury vehicle he sits in. Michaels examines the documents with exaggerated thoroughness, her brow furrowed in disbelief.
"This is your car?"
She asks, obviously not believing it. Jamal nods, fighting to keep his voice steady as he responds.
"Yes, ma'am. I just got my new car recently."
The officer's eyes narrow, unconvinced.
"Step out of the vehicle."
She orders, her free hand now firmly gripping her holster. Jamal's composure wavers for a moment as confusion and fear wash over him. He takes a deep breath, reminding himself of his rights.
"May I ask why, officer?"
He inquires, his tone respectful, yet filled with growing unease. Michael's posture stiffens, her voice taking on a more aggressive tone.
"We've had reports of a stolen vehicle matching this description. Now step out of the car."
The accusation hangs heavy in the air, each word a blow to Jamal's dignity. He feels a surge of anger rising within him, but knows that expressing it could worsen the situation. Slowly, Jamal opens the car door, his movements careful. As he stands, he becomes acutely aware of curious neighbors emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Their gazes moves between him and the officer, a mix of concern and judgment painting their faces. Michaels begins to pat Jamal down, her touch rough and impersonal.
"Pretty nice ride for a young black guy like you."
Her words dripped with accusation.
"How'd you afford something like this?"
The question stung Jamal, as it was clear this was happening solely because of the color of his skin. Jamal struggles to maintain his composure as the humiliation of being treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood washes over him. He can feel the weight of the onlookers' stares, their whispers carrying on the breeze. His mind races, torn between asserting his rights and avoiding any action that could be seen as resistance. Officer Michaels, sensing the growing audience, seems to double down on her actions. Her movements become more aggressive, her voice louder, as if to justify her suspicions to the gathering crowd.
"Spread your legs."
She barks, kicking at Jamal's feet to widen his stance. Jamal closes his eyes for a moment and calms himself. When he opens them, his gaze is steady, his voice well controlled.
"Officer,"
He says, each word measured and clear.
"I'd like to call for assistance. I believe there's been a misunderstanding."
Officer Michaels asks who Jamal wants to get assistance from. Jamal thinks of the neighbors he's known for years. He turns, hoping for support, but sees Mrs. Johnson from across the street step out onto her porch, arms crossed tightly over her chest. She's known him since he was a boy, watching him grow into the respectable young man he is now. Yet her brow furrows as she takes in the scene. Nearby, Mr. Patel, usually smiling from his corner store, leans against his doorframe with uncertainty in his eyes. Jamal's gaze pleads for their help, but their hesitation betrays him. Jamal's mind races as he stands there, hands still raised. He's well aware of how this looks. A young black man being confronted by the police, treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood. The urge to shout, to defend himself, to make everyone understand the injustice of the situation burns in his throat, but he swallows it down, knowing that any show of aggression could make things worse. Officer Michaels feels the pressure of the onlooker's eyes. With each passing moment, she becomes more agitated, her voice rising as she repeats her demands.
I need to see some identification, sir. Now.
The presence of the growing audience seems to harden her resolve, pushing her to push her authority even more forcefully. Jamal takes a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. He speaks slowly, his voice calm, but he was actually angry about the whole situation.
Officer, I've already told you, this is my car. I live here. I'm not reaching for anything until you tell me why I'm being detained.
The gathered neighbors exchange glances, their reactions full of judgment. Some shake their heads, talking about kids these days, and just cooperate with the police. Others stand in uncomfortable silence, unsure of how to react to the scene. As the standoff drags on, Jamal makes a decision. Feeling the pain of his neighbor's betrayal, he slowly reaches for his phone, his hands steady.
I'm going to call for assistance,
he announces.
I want to make sure my rights are protected.
Officer Michaels tenses, her hand instinctively moving towards her holster.
Sir, put the phone down. I haven't given you permission to make any calls.
The atmosphere grows thick with tension. Neighbors lean forward, watching intently as the situation is on the edge of escalation. Jamal's finger hovers over the screen, his jaw set in determination. In this moment, he's not just fighting for himself, but for every person who's ever been wrongly accused, every life turned upside down by unchecked bias. The weight of the moment settles over the street like a heavy blanket. Each person present, Jamal, Officer Michaels, and the silent observers, finds themselves at a crossroads. Their actions in the next few moments will ripple out, affecting not just this encounter, but the very fabric of their community. As the tense standoff between Jamal and Officer Michaels reaches a breaking point, a police cruiser suddenly pulls up to the scene. A superior officer steps out, his poise stern. He also had this air of authority about him. As he approaches, his eyes widen.
What's going on here?
The superior seemed like the savior that will put an end to all this. He was older, with salt and pepper hair, and a face lined by years of dealing with tense situations like this. Or so Jamal thought. But something about the way he moved toward Officer Michaels, and the look exchanged between them, immediately sent a shiver down Jamal's spine. This wasn't a rescue, it was something far worse. As the superior officer came to stand beside Michaels, he looked at the scene with a slow, deliberate gaze. His eyes locked onto Jamal's, and for a moment, there was a scary silence. Then, in a voice so low and calm it was almost conversational, the superior officer said,
Well, another one trying to push his luck.
Jamal's heart dropped. He had been expecting this man to bring some sense of order, to correct Officer Michaels and resolve the situation. Instead, he now realized that the man in front of him wasn't here to help. He was here to solidify the nightmare that was happening. Jamal looked at the neighbors, hoping someone would step in to help. But what he saw made him feel even worse. The neighbors, who had first come out of their houses looking confused, were now more confident and bold. They were talking amongst themselves, exchanging glances that ranged from smug satisfaction to quiet indifference. It was as if the arrival of more police had confirmed their suspicions about Jamal, even though he had done nothing wrong. The weight of their judgment pressed down on him like a crushing wave. The superior officer leaned in toward Michaels, speaking just loud enough for Jamal to hear.
He's delaying. Radio in for backup. We'll need to make sure this doesn't escalate.
Jamal was seriously getting scared now. What did they even mean? He wasn't resisting. He hadn't done anything wrong. But the way the superior officer said it so calmly, almost bored, sent a terrifying message. This was about more than just his car. He was in the middle of something far darker, something he hadn't fully grasped until now. They weren't treating him like a suspect. They were treating him like a threat that needed to be neutralized. Officer Michaels smiled as she obediently lifted her radio.
Requesting additional units to my location.
She said. Her voice sounded excited.
We have a potentially dangerous suspect.
Jamal's breath almost stopped. Dangerous? He had not raised his voice, yet here they were, preparing for a full show of force. He took a step backward, his eyes moving to the growing crowd of neighbors. Their faces blurred together, some of them filming the scene, others whispering amongst themselves. But none of them moved to help him. None of them seemed to care. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He was utterly alone. The silence on the street was crazy, broken only by the crackle of Officer Michaels' radio. Moments later, the wail of sirens cut through the air, growing louder with each passing second. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest as a second police cruiser pulled up, its flashing lights casting scary shadows on the faces of the onlookers. 2 more officers stepped out, their hands instinctively resting on their holsters as they approached the scene. Jamal watched them, trying to gauge whether they would bring some measure of reason to the situation. But the looks on their faces told him otherwise. They were here to back up their fellow officers, no questions asked. The superior officer gave them a small nod, signaling for them to position themselves around Jamal. Now there were 4 officers in total, each one standing at a different point around him, creating a circle that felt less like a protective barrier and more like a trap closing in. Jamal could feel his heart in his throat, his breathing growing shallow. The world around him seemed to slow down, every detail sharper and more scary. The light of the officers' badges, the little shifts in their postures, the cold metal of the handcuffs clipped to their belts. This all added to the increased sense that something terrible was about to happen. As one of the new officers took in the scene, his gaze fell on Jamal's phone, still clutched in his hand. The officer's expression immediately changed.
Put the phone down,
He ordered.
No one has given you permission to record.
Jamal's hand tightened around the phone, his last lifeline to the outside world. He wasn't recording. He hadn't even thought to press the button in the heat of the moment. But now, as the officers closed in, he realized just how important it was to capture this moment, to document what was happening in case things went out of control. But before he could respond, the superior officer stepped forward, his hand on his radio. His eyes locked onto Jamal's with a look that sent ice through his veins.
We're not going to let you film us.
He said, his voice low, but very scary.
You think you're going to use this against us? Not this time.
Jamal's heart pounded in his chest as the officer's words sank in. Not this time. What did that mean? Were they planning something? His mind raced as he tried to piece together the situation. The more he thought about it, the more terrifying the realization became. He glanced at the officers surrounding him, each one poised and ready, their hands inches from their weapons. The tension in the air was thick and suffocating. The street, once quiet and peaceful, now felt like a pressure cooker on the verge of exploding. Jamal's gaze went to the neighbors again, silently pleading for someone to step in, for someone to say something. But their faces were plain, their eyes cold. Even Mrs. Johnson, who had known him since he was a child, stood there with her arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with a detached curiosity. Jamal felt his stomach twist. They weren't going to help him. They weren't going to do anything. It was then that Jamal heard it, a voice coming through the radio in the superior officer's hand.
Make sure there's no video left behind.
His blood ran cold. They were going to erase everything. Erase him. Panic went through Jamal's body. His mind screamed at him to run, to get out of there, but he knew that any sudden movement would be a death sentence. He couldn't move. He couldn't call for help. Every option felt like a trap. The superior officer's voice broke through his thoughts.
You think you can push back? You're out of options, son. You can either comply or we'll make this a lot harder for you.
Jamal stared at him. The world around him seemed to close in, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a hammer. Every instinct in his body told him to fight, to resist, but he knew the terrifying truth. He was alone. The tension slowly increased. Jamal felt trapped between the officers and the glaring eyes of the neighborhood. But then, something in the superior officer's behavior shifted. He squinted at Jamal, as if trying to place him. For a moment, it seemed like the man was having second thoughts, but just as quickly, his face hardened again. Jamal knew this wasn't over. Then, as if by a stroke of fate, one of the newer officers, Officer Davis, who had arrived in the second cruiser, stepped forward and looked deeply at Jamal. "Wait a second," he said. He glanced between the others before slowly approaching Jamal, clearly hesitant but curious. "I've seen you before." Jamal swallowed hard, his voice thick with a need to be heard, but still controlled.
I'm not a criminal. I'm a college student. I go to law school, actually. Look, I live in this neighborhood. You've got the wrong guy. Davis hesitated, something in Jamal's tone making him pause.
College student?
He asked, his suspicion reducing. The superior officer glared at Davis but allowed him to continue. Officer Michaels, however, stood rigidly, her hand still on her holster. Her eyes narrowed as she spoke, her voice filled with disbelief.
Don't buy into his excuses. We've been after someone who matches his description. A black guy, mid-20s, high-end car, hacking into our system and exposing officers' personal data.
Michael's words sent a chill through Jamal. Everything seemed so ridiculous that he almost laughed. He didn't know anything about hacking, and the only thing he cared about with the police was avoiding them. But Officer Davis frowned, shaking his head. "This doesn't add up," he said quietly.
I've seen this guy before at a community event, I think. You're Jamal Freeman, right?
He then turned fully to Jamal, his posture more relaxed. Jamal blinked in surprise, a hint of hope sparking in his chest.
Yeah, that's me. I volunteer at local events. I'm studying to be a judge, like my father.
Davis nodded, the pieces slowly clicking into place.
Yeah, that's where I remember you from. My kid brother's school held a career day last month. You were one of the speakers.
Jamal nodded, feeling a small sense of relief, but the cold stare from Michaels was still there. She stepped forward, her expression hardening even more.
I don't care where he's been. He fits the profile and he's driving a car that looks just like the one reported stolen last week.
Davis glanced at the superior officer for guidance, but the superior officer's expression remained unreadable, his hand still in his radio. Davis then insisted that they need to run this properly. This might not be the guy they've been looking for, but Michaels wasn't listening. Her eyes remained locked on Jamal, her jaw clenched. A lifetime of built-up bias was in her mind, flashing back to the lessons her father had drilled into her since she was a child. Black men in fancy cars are criminals. She could hear her father's cruel voice in her mind, saying words she had tried to forget but couldn't get away from. This was more than a traffic stop for her. This was a fight to prove herself, to uphold the ugly beliefs she had carried for far too long. Jamal could see it in her face. Her hatred wasn't just professional, it was personal. She wasn't seeing him as a college student or a neighbor or even a human being. To her, he was just another stereotype, one she'd been taught to despise. And that's when something inside Jamal snapped. He took a breath and stood taller, his voice calm but firm.
You know, Officer Michaels, you haven't even bothered to run my plates properly, have you? You saw me, you saw this car, and you made an assumption because of the color of my skin.
Michael's eyes filled with anger, but before she could say anything, Davis stepped in between them.
We need to follow the rules. Let me check his plates again. Look at his license and figure out what's really happening here.
The superior officer, sensing the shift in the air, nodded silently. Michaels, however, remained furious, her fists clenching at her sides. But she said nothing as Davis quickly moved to check Jamal's registration and run the plates. Time seemed to move slowly, each second feeling like an hour, as Jamal stood there feeling like the weight of the world was on him. He could see Michaels's tense body, with anger just below the surface, ready to explode. This wasn't just about the car or the supposed hacker. This was about something far deeper, something uglier. Finally, Davis returned, holding the results on his handheld device.
The car's clean.
He said quietly.
Registration checks out. No reports of it being stolen.
Jamal exhaled slowly, the weight lifting slightly from his chest. But it wasn't over. He could still feel Michaels's eyes on him, burning with anger.
I told you,
Jamal said.
you had the wrong guy.
The superior officer sighed heavily, rubbing his temples as the tension drained from the situation. Looks like we made a mistake here. There was an apology in his tone. Michaels, on the other hand, looked like she was about to explode.
This doesn't make sense.
She snapped, glaring at Jamal as if the truth was somehow his fault.
He fits the profile. He must be hiding something.
Davis shook his head, his voice firm now.
Michaels, let it go. We were wrong. This isn't our guy.
But Michaels wasn't ready to let it go. Years of hatred, built on the foundation of her abusive father's teachings, boiled over in her. She wasn't just a cop right now. She was the result of her father's toxic legacy, and she was about to break under the weight of it. Suddenly, the superior officer spoke, his voice cold.
Michaels, that's enough. Stop.
For a moment, it seemed like Michaels might not listen. Her hand hovered near her holster, and she was breathing fast and hard. Then, as if she understood how serious the situation was, she stopped. Slowly, her hand dropped to her side, but her eyes never left Jamal, and the hatred there was unmistakable. The superior officer's voice softened slightly as he addressed Jamal.
We'll get this sorted out. You're free to go, sir.
But Jamal wasn't done. He wasn't going to just walk away from this.
You think this is sorted out?
He asked, his voice stronger now.
You targeted me because of the color of my skin. You didn't check the facts. You just assumed.
The neighbors, who had been watching silently, began to talk amongst themselves. The reality of what had just happened settled over them. And then, to everyone's shock, Officer Michaels cracked. Tears welled up in her eyes as the weight of her father's bias and her own failures finally crushed her. Her voice shook as she said was just doing her job.
No,
Jamal said, his voice calm but sharp.
you weren't. You were being racist. And now you'll have to live with the consequences.